You're going to hear a proper introduction from Andrew Zeller, the actual host of tonight's event, and your moderator. So I will leave that pleasant chore to him. I'll just want to say a word of welcome and to salute, first of all, you for being here on a subject that is of great and increasing importance, I believe, across our country, and maybe most particularly in its centers of free inquiry, its colleges and universities. Here tonight to help us think through and wrestle with these complex and often puzzling questions, we have a longtime leader, thought leader in this area, a genuine scholar, a scholar in action, champion of civil liberties, and of course the longtime chair of the American Civil Liberties Union. I'll just say one more thing, that in an age of characterized by a lot of sophistry, by a lot of people who are loud for this principle or that principle until it doesn't look like it's going to deliver the result they want, and then find a way to rationalize around it, our guest tonight has always adhered tenaciously and faithfully in an intellectually honest fashion to the principles that she holds most dear, and those happen to be principles most central to the functioning of our free society. So we're very grateful to have her, very grateful and proud of our graduate student government for enlisting her to come here. And now to introduce tonight's guest, the chair of our Purdue graduate student government, Andrew Zeller.
Thank you very much, President Daniels, and thank you for your support that makes this event possible. My name's Andrew Zeller. I'm the president of Purdue Graduate Student Government, and welcome all of you. Thank you very much for coming to the second installment of the new PGSG Lectureship series. We kicked it off in the fall with a lecture by Jeffrey Stone and Azhar Majid about the Chicago principles, and now we're very, very happy to have Nadine Strossen here today to talk about defending freedom for the thought that we hate. The lectureship series aims to bring in a broad and diverse set of noteworthy thinkers to really benefit not just graduate students, but campus discussions on critical issues to our society. So if you are a member of a program or department, school, college, that has an interest in bringing such a speaker to campus, we are looking for partners on these events going forward, and for our contact information, you can go to purdue.edu/PGSG. So our topic tonight is free expression, and there's really no one better to talk about this than our distinguished guest, Nadine Strossen. She's currently the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law at New York Law School. And from 1991 to 2008, she served as the president of the American Civil Liberties Union, the first woman to ever hold that post. To say that she's written, lectured, and practiced extensively in constitutional law, civil liberties, and international human rights is one of the biggest understatements I could possibly make. She's been named twice as one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America by the National Law Journal. She's been awarded numerous honorary doctorates. She's been a guest of virtually every national news program on every network. She's published hundreds of works, including 2 books. And one I want to specifically mention, because if you haven't read it, you should absolutely take the time to read it, and that's Defending Pornography, Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights. It's a really fantastic book. It was named a notable book of 1995 by the New York Times. Nadine's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I could go on and on and on. She's been named by every magazine as one of the most influential people in any field for anything. So her lecture tonight, as I mentioned earlier, is Defending Freedom for the Thought That We Hate, including hate speech. And I want to mention that we will have lots of time for audience Q&A after her lecture. So be thinking up questions, and then once she's done with her lecture, we'll have 2 mics, I believe, positioned that you can come up and ask questions on anything about the lecture, but as well as any topic on civil liberties. And I imagine that a few of you might have questions relating to recent Supreme Court developments. So without further ado, it's really my true honor to welcome Nadine Strossen.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, President Daniels and Andrew, for that warm introduction, and the audience for the warm welcome. And Andrew, I do defend your right to engage in hyperbolic speech. I'd also like to thank Andrew for all of his hard work in organizing this program and for his outstanding efforts on behalf of free speech. I'm really delighted to talk about this essential topic on this campus in particular because it has been a national leader in reaffirming free speech at a critical time, thereby earning the rare green light designation from FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, a terrific organization with which I work closely. You should all be proud that Purdue is one of the most speech-protective campuses in the whole country, and that was something that I followed and cheered long before I had the pleasure of meeting Andrew or being invited here. You earned a lot of nationwide publicity from those of us who hold free speech and academic freedom dear. And for that stature and accomplishment, I want to thank the leadership of President Daniels, Andrew Zeller, Emily Watson, as well as the Board of Trustees and the undergraduate and graduate student governments. Now, as a lifelong free speech advocate, and it's true, it did start when I was in kindergarten, but I'll tell you that after the event. I'm so sorry that our hard-won free speech rights are losing support on too many other campuses, where, as the Supreme Court has stressed, these rights are especially important on our campuses. But sadly, recent surveys have shown, and President Daniels told me about yet another one that just came out, confirming that too many students are at best ignorant about free speech and at worst hostile toward it. The conclusion I draw from that fact is that free speech proponents, including yours truly, have not done as good a job as we should, as we must, in explaining why free speech is so important and why we should resist imposing more limits on it, beyond the substantial limits that the Supreme Court has already upheld, as I will explain in more detail later. But for now, I want to note that much speech that people have in mind when they say we should restrict offensive speech or hate speech, much of what they're afraid of, concerned about, is in fact already restricted, because it causes certain concrete harms which the Supreme Court has held do justify limiting or punishing it. Specifically, the court has held that we may restrict speech that poses a threat or constitutes harassment or incites illegal or violent conduct or is an element in a hate crime. And civil libertarians agree. But we civil libertarians also agree with the court that we should not punish speech that does not cause these kinds of harms. In other words, we should not punish speech for the sole reason that its message is offensive or hateful. Surveys show that the more people think about these issues, the more they tend to support free speech. After all, it's counterintuitive to support freedom to voice ideas that we ourselves reject. So it's not surprising that our initial instinctive reaction is that those ideas should be suppressed. This was recognized by no less important a free speech champion than former Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in an historic opinion that that strongly endorse the core free speech precept quoted in the title of my talk, and that comes from a Holmes opinion, that the First Amendment protects freedom for the thought that we hate. But Holmes recognized the natural tendency to resist that notion. As he explained, persecution for the expression of opinion seems perfectly logical. If you have no doubt of your premises and want a certain result with all your heart, you naturally express your wishes in law and sweep away all opposition. So having thus recognized the innate appeal of suppressing hated thoughts, Holmes goes on to explain why, on reflection, we must resist that instinct. And he goes on, but when people have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may well come to believe that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. Therefore, we should be eternally vigilant against attempts to check the expression of opinions that we loathe and even believe to be fraught with death unless they imminently threaten the country. Author Nat Hentoff well captured the tendency to seek suppression of whatever idea we hate in the title of a book he wrote, Freedom of Speech for Me, but Not for Thee, How the Left and Right Relentlessly Censor Each Other. And let me also quote the Los Angeles Times. The urge to censor is the most fundamental human drive, far more basic than the sex drive. Throughout my talk, I'm going to use the term offensive speech to refer to any speech conveying any thought that any of us hates because we consider the idea to be offensive, evil, dangerous, upsetting, harmful in any way. Today, we tend to use the term hate speech to refer to a specific type of offensive speech, namely biased or stereotyped ideas on the basis of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or any other aspect of social identity. Contrary to much popular misunderstanding, there is no general exception to the First Amendment's free speech guarantee on the ground that the speech's message is offensive or hateful. To the contrary, the Supreme Court has repeatedly reaffirmed that the bedrock, its word, bedrock principle underlying our free speech rights is that government may never suppress speech just because officials or citizens disapprove of the ideas that it conveys, even if the vast majority of citizens consider those ideas absolutely abhorrent. This cardinal principle is usually called content neutrality or viewpoint neutrality. It bars government from restricting any speech just because of any negative psychological or emotional reaction to its message. Instead, the government must neutrally and even-handedly protect freedom equally for all ideas. And this important duty belongs to all government bodies, including public universities such as Purdue. As a free speech champion, I, of course, encourage all of us to question and critique all orthodoxies, including speech-protective Supreme Court precedents. So I hope that I can persuade any First Amendment skeptics in this audience to accept this established jurisprudence, not because it is established, but rather because on reflection you are persuaded that it is correct. And toward that end, I'd like to quote someone who speaks with special authority in endorsing these principles, namely President Barack Obama. His expertise on this issue stems from not only his background as a constitutional law professor, but also from his vast experience as the target of vicious, vile hate speech, right? Assailing him on the basis of his African American race, his purported Muslim religion, his alleged non-U.S. citizenship, and his political views and actions. Yet President Obama has strongly endorsed the classic First Amendment view that hate speech should be strongly protected, not despite his commitment to combating racial and other discrimination, but rather precisely for that reason. In several recent forums, the president has repeatedly stressed this point. For example, at a town hall meeting last fall, President Obama championed campus free speech, even for, I'm quoting him, language that is offensive to African Americans or sends a demeaning signal toward women, close quote. After all, as campus activists in the Black Lives Matter and anti-sexual assault movements remind us, meaningful reform requires candid, in-depth conversations about difficult, sensitive subjects, race, sex, and gender. President Obama made precisely this point in a recent interview. Quote, being an activist involves hearing the other side and engaging in a dialogue, because that's how change happens. The civil rights movement happened because the leadership consistently sought to understand the views of the other side, even views that were appalling to them. President Obama likewise has repeatedly championed a time-honored First Amendment precept that the appropriate response to hate speech is not to suppress it, but rather to refute it. As he said, anybody you disagree with, you should have an argument with them, but you shouldn't silence them by saying, I'm too sensitive to hear what you have to say. Now, he does recognize that it may be especially burdensome to students who are targets of hate speech to answer back, but he recognizes that this is essential for the social reforms they champion. As he put it, yes, this may put a slightly higher burden on minority students, but you're not going to make the kinds of deep changes in society that those students want without taking on their opponents in a courageous way. Now, it's also essential for others to respond to hate speech, not only its targets, but also, especially, other leaders in the pertinent community. So on university campuses, the university president, as well as student government organizations should also speak out strongly. In response to hate speech, they should defend the right to convey even hateful, hated ideas, but they should also denounce such ideas. I like to describe this approach as censuring speech, not censoring speech. President Daniels recently pledged precisely this approach here at Purdue. As he said, there would be no swifter or surer way to be condemned and ostracized at Purdue than to say or do anything even remotely racist, and the condemnation would start with me. Another university president who consistently led the way in condemning hate speech, even as he defended students' rights to engage in it, was former Harvard president Derek Bok. For example, when some Harvard students hung Confederate flags and swastikas from their dormitory windows overlooking Harvard Yard, President Bok swiftly issued a thoughtful statement strongly criticizing the displays, but equally strongly defending free speech principles. I'd like to quote a portion of the letter that he immediately distributed to the Harvard community and beyond. The fact that speech is protected by the First Amendment does not necessarily mean that it is right, proper, or civil. I agree with the vast majority in this community that hanging a Confederate flag or swastika in public view is insensitive and unwise, because any satisfaction it gives to the students who display these symbols is far outweighed by the discomfort it causes to many others. But no community can become humane and caring by restricting what its members can say. The worst offenders will simply find other ways to irritate and insult. Those who are not malicious but merely insensitive are not likely to learn by having their flags or posters torn down. And I fear that the resulting publicity would eventually attract more attention to the offensive material than would ever have occurred otherwise. In conclusion, our concern for free speech keeps the university from removing the offensive symbols, but it should not prevent us from urging the students involved to take more account of the feelings and sensibilities of others. Most of the time, I suspect we will succeed in this endeavor. By so doing, I believe that we will have acted in the manner most likely to help us create a truly understanding, supportive community. For the remainder of my talk, I'm going to amplify on the persuasive points that were made by the three presidents I've quoted, namely, in the order I cited them, Presidents Obama, Daniels, and Bach. First, I'm going to explain further why the Supreme Court has been right to uphold freedom for offensive expression. This is a broad topic, as there are so many different types of expression that various members of our society consider offensive, since we are so wonderfully diverse with very different ideas, values, and tastes. One of my favorite cartoons underscores this point. It shows three people in an art museum looking at a classic nude female torso, a fragment of an ancient sculpture minus head and limbs, and each viewer's reaction is shown in an air bubble. So the first one thinks, art, and the second one thinks, smut, and the third thinks, an insult to amputees. So, given the wide-ranging views about what expression is offensive, if we allowed government to regulate or punish any speech that any person or group considered offensive, we'd have very little, if any, speech left. To illustrate this point, I'm going to cite and briefly describe three types of expression that various government officials, supported by many members of the public, have tried to suppress as offensive. The first is hate speech, which I've already touched on. Just a bit more than a year ago, cartoonists and editors at the satiric French magazine Charlie Hebdo were, of course, brutally assassinated by terrorists who considered their cartoons to be hate speech against Muslims. In the U.S., fortunately, we've been spared from such murders so far. There have been attempted murders of satirists, but so far, no success. But we have not been spared from many measures that seek to suppress speech on the very same rationale, namely that the speech offends individuals on the basis of religion or other aspects of their identity. Of course, this is the rationale that has led to the widespread campus codes that bar students from expressing certain views about these topics. And again, hats off to Purdue for having one of the few green lights for not suppressing hate speech. A second major category of expression that is constantly targeted for suppression because many people find it offensive is anything to do with sex or gender. Recent examples range from the ongoing barring of offensive or indecent expression on broadcast radio or TV on pain of enormous fines and even losing a broadcast license. The Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, defines such prohibited offensive broadcast expression as any depictions or descriptions of sexual or excretory organs or activities. These include the so-called 7 filthy words, the 4-letter words that comedian George Carlin satirized in his famous monologue with that title. And that is why my radio and TV interviews are constantly bleeped when I discuss a landmark Supreme Court decision, Cohen versus California, because it upheld the right to use the word fuck. So that word necessarily appears in the Supreme Court's official, beautiful bound reports since way back in 1971 when the court decided Cohen. But to this day, almost 50 years later, that word is still banned from the airwaves, even when you're discussing the Supreme Court opinion, the only context in which I use it, I assure you. Just one utterance of any such filthy word triggers a staggering penalty of $325,000, and I am not exaggerating. Not surprisingly, therefore, we have huge self-censorship on the broadcast media, as well as direct punishment by the FCC. I'm going to cite one especially ironic example because you never know what you're missing when there is self-censorship or even direct censorship. I'm acutely aware of the many serious presentations that are kept off the airwaves because of these incapacitating fines due to offensive sexual or extraterritorial expression. Several years ago, so here's just one example, and it's the tip of the iceberg. Several years ago, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of a landmark free speech case in which the ACLU successfully defended Allen Ginsberg's acclaimed poem, Howl, against a criminal prosecution. Since then, Howl has become the best-selling poem of all time. So to celebrate the half-century anniversary of this historic free speech victory, the Pacifica radio station in New York was planning to air a recording of Allen Ginsberg reading his famous poem. However, given the number of offensive four-letter words in the poem, each and every one of which triggered a $325,000 fine. You don't have to be a math genius like Andrew to figure out that the radio station was literally risking bankruptcy if it went ahead and aired that poem. So sadly, it made a prudent business decision not to do so. What a way to celebrate a free speech anniversary. And there are many other recent examples of expression touching on sex or gender that is suppressed as offensive. Many of these come from colleges and universities because too many have adopted an overly broad, distorted concept of sexual harassment as encompassing any expression about sex or gender that anyone finds subjectively unwelcome, no matter how unreasonable or even irrational that subjective reaction might be. The most egregious recent example is the prolonged sexual harassment investigation of that Northwestern University conducted against film professor Laura Kipnis last year because of an article she published in the Chronicle of Higher Education in which, ironically, she was criticizing the exaggerated, distorted concept of sexual harassment that is prevalent on campus. For months, the university subjected her to Star Chamber-style interrogations. This wrong-headed concept of sexual harassment flies in the face of the much narrower definition that the Supreme Court laid down and which Purdue commendably has adopted. In fact, Purdue has appropriately adopted this concept generally to apply to harassment of any type, not only based on sex or gender. I'm going to quote your definition of prohibited harassment, which does square with the Supreme Court's First Amendment holdings. Unwelcome, targeted conduct, including speech, that is so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive, and that so undermines and detracts from the educational experience of those to whom the speech or behavior is targeted, that the targeted person is effectively denied equal access to the university's resources and opportunities. Under this appropriately focused concept, Laura Kipnis would never have been investigated, nor would we see the constant stream of campus punishments of professors merely for referring to sex, even when it is directly relevant to their teaching, whenever even one person finds the reference offensive or unwelcome. Many cultural commentators say that Americans' tendency to take offense at sexual expression traces back to our Puritan heritage. This point was well made by my fellow Minnesotan, Garrison Keeler. He said, "My ancestors were Puritans from England who arrived here in 1648 in the hope of finding greater restrictions than were permissible under English law at the time." Since sexuality is an especially personal area, our views about it are especially subjective. So it is especially wrong for the government to take away our individual right to choose in this area. We can't delegate to any official or anyone else the deeply personal choices about what sexual expression we will see or not see. 60 years ago, the Supreme Court created the obscenity exception to the First Amendment for expression that is patently offensive to prevailing community values. Yet, in all the decades since then, the justices haven't been able to agree on whether any particular expression is sufficiently offensive to be deemed obscene, let alone what standard to use in making that determination. The most famous line in the court's unsuccessful efforts came from former Justice Potter Stewart. You've all heard it as he admitted, "I cannot define it, but I know it when I see it." The problem, though, is that every judge and every person sees a different it. And this definitional problem persists even when you try to target a different category of allegedly offensive sexual expression. For example, some feminists have decried sexual expression that they view as demeaning or degrading to women, which they label with the stigmatizing term pornography. And the city of Indianapolis was one city in this country that did adopt that definition until the ACLU and others succeeded in challenging it in the Supreme Court as violating both free speech and women's rights. I won't go off too much in that direction, but I want to illustrate the inherent subjectivity of this new concept as well. So pornography was the stigmatizing term for sexual expression that demeaned or degraded women. In contrast, these anti-porn feminists use the term erotica for sexual expression that they did not deem degrading to women. So how can you tell the difference? Well, as one woman put it, what turns me on is erotica. What turns you on is pornography. We individuals even have different perspectives about whether any given expression has any sexual content at all. That's captured by the old joke about the man who sees every ink blot his psychiatrist shows him as wildly erotic. When his psychiatrist says to him, "You're obsessed with sex," the man answers, "What do you mean I'm obsessed? You're the one who keeps showing me all these dirty pictures." Now I'd like to turn to a third category of expression that has been deemed widely offensive, and that is expression that is seen as unpatriotic. A vivid example is burning or otherwise desecrating the U.S. flag. Enforcing the core content neutrality principle, the Supreme Court has upheld the free speech right to engage in such symbolic speech. But public opinion polls show that the vast majority of the public considers this expression deeply offensive. So they and their elected officials have been pushing for a constitutional amendment to overturn the Supreme Court's rulings and to carve out an exception from the free speech guarantee specifically for flag desecration. In fact, the last time the U.S. Senate considered this amendment, it came just one vote short of passing it by the two-thirds supermajority. And it has already been approved by two-thirds of the House of Representatives and three-fourths of the state. So in short, for overwhelming majorities of our fellow citizens, the most offensive, hateful, hated speech of all, from their perspective, is flag desecration. On the other hand, I can use the flag to illustrate how completely, irreducibly subjective it is to label some speech as offensive or hate speech. Recently, some college students treated the flag itself as hate speech. In other words, they had the exact opposite view from the many folks who want to amend the Constitution because they so deeply revere the flag. Last spring, a group of student government leaders at the University of California, Irvine, voted to ban the display of the U.S. flag due to what they viewed as its hateful and hated message. Let me quote their resolution. "The American flag has been flown in instances of colonialism and imperialism and can therefore be interpreted as hate speech. As the Supreme Court has recognized, freedom of speech is especially endangered whenever the government bans or regulates expression under such vague, subjective labels as offensive or hateful. Lacking any clear, objective guidelines, enforcing authorities necessarily have to exercise their unfettered discretion according to their own subjective tastes or those of politically powerful community members. So the enforcement patterns will be arbitrary at best, discriminatory at worst. At best, which particular expressions will be deemed offensive or hateful will be completely unpredictable, which often causes what courts call a chilling effect, because no one wants to run the risk of investigations and prosecution, let alone punishment, so people self-censor, not engaging in expression that might possibly be deemed offensive or hateful by the powers that be. The unfettered discretion that is required to enforce such vague concepts as offensive or hateful is also likely to be exercised in a discriminatory way, singling out expression that's produced by or appeals to individuals or groups who are relatively unpopular or powerless. Indeed, recent obscenity prosecutions and recent FCC indecency penalties have targeted expressions of lesbian and gay sexuality, rap music by young African American men, and feminist anthems. Likewise, campus hate speech codes have been enforced disproportionately against the very racial minorities who are their intended beneficiaries. And we shouldn't be surprised about these enforcement patterns, should we? As the Black Lives Matter movement has forcefully reminded us, this is the general pattern for all laws. They are enforced disproportionately against African Americans and other minority groups. In the remainder of my talk, I'm going to focus specifically on hate speech because polls show that many college students don't understand why such speech should be constitutionally protected. In fact, I've read stories about your own campus, which indicates that some of your students and faculty members right here support punishing hate speech. Again, to echo the Oliver Wendell Holmes passage I quoted near the start of my talk, I fully understand the appeal of suppressing such odious ideas. We deeply oppose and fight against bias and discrimination, so why allow speech that reflects it? My bottom line answer is that censoring hate speech will actually do more harm than good to the urgently important goals that I wholeheartedly share with the proponents of such censorship, namely eradicating biased attitudes and discriminatory actions. Now, I've already made several points that support this conclusion that censoring it would do more harm than good. In my remaining time, I'd like to further explain these and other reasons for this conclusion. But before I do that, I want to give you a brief primer, as I promised earlier, on the many situations in which hate speech may be restricted because of some specific harm that it causes beyond its psychic or emotional impact. So it's actually misleading to say unqualifiedly that we do not and may not punish hate speech under traditional First Amendment principles. To the contrary, the Supreme Court has held, and civil libertarians agree, that we may punish the substantial subsets of hate speech that inflict certain serious harms, namely threats, harassment, incitement, and hate crimes. So I'd like to explain those important concepts in a bit more detail. First, if speech conveys a threat to commit violence and the targets of that threat reasonably fear that they will be subject to violence, that speech may be punished. Second, hate speech that is directly targeted at a specific individual or small group of individuals may well rise to the level of punishable harassment, as I noted earlier, quoting Purdue's policy on point. Third, we may punish any hate speech that intentionally incites imminent violence or lawlessness that is likely to happen. Finally, hate speech may be punished if it constitutes an element in a so-called hate crime, such as assault or vandalism. The government may treat such a crime as more serious and impose an increased punishment when the victim or target is singled out for discriminatory reasons, such as race or religion. So in sum, a lot of hate speech is already unprotected because it causes the specific sorts of harm that people have in mind when they advocate punishing hate speech. So a new exception would be warranted only for the purpose of punishing speech that causes none of those tangible harms, but rather causes solely psychic or emotional harms. And from now on, I'm going to refer to this subset of hate speech that is constitutionally protected as psychically harmful hate speech. Now, to resist punishing psychically harmful hate speech is not at all to deny that such speech does indeed cause palpable psychic harm. We protect speech precisely because of its great power to affect our emotions and psyches, both negatively and positively. To explain why, let me quote an old saying, and that is that the cure is worse than the disease. Even worse than speech's power to wound is government's power to pick and choose which among the infinite array of wounding words it will punish. Take one example. Should it punish displaying the U.S. flag, as has been contended to be hate speech recently, or should it punish desecrating the U.S. flag as hate speech, which has also been advocated? By taking those choices away from us as individuals, government would strip us of the power to choose which powerful words we will utter, which we will listen to, as well as which ones we will ignore, reject, and answer back. The Supreme Court strongly reaffirmed these core principles a few years ago in upholding the right to engage in extremely hurtful hate speech, namely picketing outside funerals of slain members of the U.S. military with picket signs conveying insulting, offensive views toward military members, Catholics, and sexual orientation minorities. For example, one sign read, "Thank God for dead soldiers." Yet, over only one dissent, the court held that this hurtful hate speech was constitutionally protected. As it explained, speech is powerful. It can stir people to action, move them to tears of both joy and sorrow, and, as it did here, inflict great pain. We cannot react to that pain by punishing the speaker. As a nation, we have chosen a different course to protect even hurtful speech to ensure that we do not stifle public debate. The picketers in this case were from the Westboro Baptist Church, which is based in Kansas. Its beliefs are summed up by its website, which is all one word, www.godhatesfags.org. I'm proud that the ACLU has defended the free speech rights of the Westboro Baptist Church, consistent with the key viewpoint neutrality principle I mentioned earlier, including in this Supreme Court case. We did this even though the Westboro Baptist Church has so strongly attacked us because of our work for the rights of sexual orientation minorities. Indeed, the church has even attacked yours truly personally. Some years ago, I was speaking at the University of Kansas, and members of the Westboro Baptist Church were picketing outside the auditorium, protesting my presence, and the messages on their picket signs were intended to be insulting, but I actually took them as backhanded compliments, which again shows the subjectivity involved here. One of the signs denounced the ACLU as the nation's #1 fag lobby. Yes. And my favorite sign in that demonstration was based on our acronym. ACLU, of course, stands for American Civil Liberties Union, but our detractors have concocted other alleged meanings, everything from always causing legal unrest to all criminals love us. Yes, we do defend rights of people accused of crime. And at my Kansas debate, the Westboro Baptist picketers came up with yet another spin on ACLU. They said that it stands for the Anal Copulators and Lesbians Union. Many years ago, we ran a contest on our ACLU website for various other interpretations of our acronym, and for me, the hands-down winner was, oh, come on, lighten up. And I do try to honor that one. As a lifelong civil rights activist, I'm thrilled by the recent resurgence of campus student activism for this vital cause, including right here at Purdue. However, expressly because of my long experience as an activist, bolstered by my scholarly research, I'm convinced that censoring psychically harmful hate speech is at best ineffective in promoting equality and at worst counterproductive. The authorities I've cited already indicate some of the many reasons for this conclusion. For example, recall President Obama's remarks. Now I'm going to just list some of the most important such reasons. Censoring hate speech increases attention to and sympathy for bigots. It drives bigoted expression and ideas underground, making it harder to identify who holds them and harder to refute them. It necessarily can address only the crudest, most vulgar expressions of discrimination, leaving untouched the more subtle, insidious, and influential ones. Laws against psychically harmful hate speech are inevitably enforced disproportionately against speech by and on behalf of members of whatever groups are relatively disempowered and marginalized in the particular community. Such dissident minority perspectives should be heard in our democracy, not only because of the speaker's free speech rights, but also so the rest of us can be aware of their views and respond to them. Moreover, in some communities, the marginalized and hence silenced voices will include the very racial and other minority groups who are the intended beneficiaries of the regulations. This type of censorship reinforces paternalistic stereotypes about members of minority groups, suggesting that they need special protections from offensive speech. It also undermines a mainstay of equal rights movements, which have always depended especially on a robust free speech concept. This censorship curbs candid intergroup dialogue about racism and other forms of bias, which is an essential precondition for reducing discrimination. Positive intergroup relations will more likely result from education and discussing misunderstandings and insensitivity. In contrast, laws targeting psychically harmful hate speech generate controversy and litigation, increasing intergroup tensions. Last but far from least, censorship is diversionary, diverting us from more meaningful strategies for combating discrimination. I now want to expand just a bit, but I'm going to engage in a little bit of self-censorship because I want to have plenty of time for audience Q&A. But let me start with the pattern that free speech has always been especially important for advancing equality causes and combating discrimination, and correspondingly, censorship has always been a strong tool for thwarting equality causes. Now, ironically, the explanation for that pattern lies in the very analysis of those who want to curb psychically harmful hate speech. They contend that racial and other minorities, as well as women, are relatively disempowered and marginalized. I agree, but precisely for that reason, censorship is not a solution. Laws censoring psychically harmful hate speech, along with other laws, are inevitably enforced disproportionately against speech by and on behalf of groups who lack political power, including government critics and members, again, of minority groups. So I'll cite just a couple examples, and believe me, they are legion. I could keep us here all night. When our northern neighbor, Canada, adopted a law punishing psychically harmful hate speech, in one of its very first enforcement actions, Canadian customs officials seized 1,500 copies of a book that various Canadian universities had tried to import from the United States. What was this dangerous, racist, sexist book? None other than Black Looks, Race and Representation by the African-American feminist scholar Bell Hooks, a professor at Oberlin. And this was typical. Let me quote a Canadian Supreme Court opinion arguing that Canada's law against psychically harmful hate speech violates both equality and free speech rights. As it said, the government has punished many intemperate statements about identifiable groups, particularly if they represent an unpopular viewpoint. Novels such as Leon Uris's pro-Zionist novel, The Hajj, faces banning. Other works, such as Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, are stopped at the border. Films have been kept out, including one entitled Nelson Mandela, ordered as an educational film by Ryerson Polytechnical Institute. Arrests are even made for distributing pamphlets containing the words, "Yankees go home." This particular pattern also holds true on university and college campuses that punish psychically harmful hate speech. One such hate speech code was in effect at the University of Michigan. Because the ACLU brought a lawsuit to challenge the code, the university was forced to disclose information about how it had been enforced, which usually is kept confidential. So we saw that even during the short time that the University of Michigan rule was in effect, there were more than 20 cases of whites charging blacks with racist speech. More importantly, there were only 2 instances in which the rule punished speech on the ground that it was racist rather than conveying some other type of bias, and both involved speech by or on behalf of black students. Let me just underscore that. 100% of the situation in which the hate speech code was enforced against racist speech, it was speech by and on behalf of African American students. Moreover, the only student who was subjected to a full-fledged disciplinary hearing and punishment was an African American accused of homophobic and sexist expression. He complained that he had been singled out because of his race and his political views. And again, I could cite many other examples, and I've published some articles that do cite examples from around the world, throughout the United States and throughout history. Then I'm just going to very briefly comment on yet another reason why censoring psychically harmful hate speech may well undermine rather than advance equality, and that is its diversionary nature. The track record of campus hate speech codes highlights this problem too, leading some former advocates of such codes to become disillusioned. I'm going to quote one example from a New York Times article. Quote, Victor De Jesus, co-president of the Wisconsin Student Association, said that he initially supported the University of Wisconsin's hate speech rule, but that he had changed his mind because he felt university officials were using it as an excuse to avoid the real problems of minority students. Mr. De Jesus said, now they can finally start putting their efforts into some of our major concerns like financial aid, student awareness, and recruitment and retention. So those of us who support increased efforts to advance equality have a special responsibility to promote other approaches that are effective. The ACLU has consistently done that, including, to cite a current example, by defending the constitutionality of affirmative action admissions programs currently before the United States Supreme Court. So I'd like to sum up the balance of what we would gain and what we would lose by censoring psychically harmful hate speech. The plus side, from the perspective of those who seek suppression, is quite limited. That's because the new suppression would extend to only a subset of hate speech, because we already punish hate speech that causes specific tangible harms, including threats and incitement. And even of that newly suppressible subset, we could only punish yet another subset, namely the most blatant expressions. So that's the plus side for advocates of this suppression. In contrast, on the cost side, there would be an incalculable chilling effect on any speech that challenges the prevailing orthodoxy in any community. And there would also be the multiple costs to the equality goal that I listed. The net loss for both speech and equality were well summarized by Henry Louis Gates, longtime chair of Harvard's African American Studies Department, as follows. And he makes a rather provocative, he uses a provocative word that President Obama recently used in making exactly the same point. That's not a trigger warning, but I guess it's the closest I'll come to giving you one. So Henry Louis Gates said, "Speech codes are symbolic acts. They let a group of people say, we are not the sort of community where we would tolerate someone saying nigger. Well, big deal. But there are other consequences, like the effect on freedom of inquiry. I think we're all bigger and more secure than that. I think we have to allow people to say even unpopular and nasty things in order to protect our right to attack our government and say whatever's on our minds." In conclusion, I would like to quote my favorite ACLU t-shirt. Thanks to movies and TV, we're all familiar with the famous right to remain silent. But this ACLU t-shirt reminds us of another right that's not as well known, but even more important, especially when seeking to advance equality and counter discrimination, including through the all-important tool of counter-speech. Namely, the t-shirt proclaims, "You have the right not to remain silent." If all of us who are committed to equal justice for all would exercise that precious right, we would wield more positive power for more positive change than any censorship. Thank you very much. I love the clock on this podium because it has not moved 1 second. So I'm doing you all a great favor. I could have treated this as the endless speech, but I truly do believe in free speech because I want to hear from you and engage in a dialogue. Is there a system of microphones or? And I'm a law professor, so if I don't get a volunteer, I'll just call on somebody, especially the backbenchers back there.
Well, the mics are coming, but if you have a question, please do come forward and then
Or if somebody could shout it, I could just repeat it from the mic up here.
I'll be a backbencher.
Great.
I have 2 questions for the audience. First, I want you to think about being offended and being made uncomfortable. How many people are made uncomfortable by being offended? How many people are offended? Thank you.
Well, people may be shy.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, now you can. Okay, who has a question? Also, Edward Price is going to be the other mic holder. Thank you.
Hi. So,
Hi.
America is supposed to at least, well, we're supposed to try at least, or okay. We're supposed to work towards becoming close to a democracy, yes?
Mm-hmm.
So, if the popular majority of the people of the democracy says that desecrating the flag should be suppressed or something like that, do we then use the First Amendment and say that we should protect the people who would like to desecrate the flag, or do we allow it to pass because it's the popular majority?
That is a fabulous question, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to make a basic point, because you're asking a question that I often get this way. Well, what about the majority? Doesn't the majority get the right to decide what ideas we'll hear and what ideas we will not hear? And so I wasn't sure exactly how you were using the word democracy, so let me answer it. The framers deliberately did not create a pure democracy, right? On the vast majority of policy issues, it is the majority through our elected representatives who get to make those decisions. Our only resort if we disagree is to try to campaign harder next time around or lobby harder. But the framers agreed that there are some rights that are so fundamental that no majority should be able to take them away from any minority, no matter how small or unpopular that minority was. That was clear in the original Constitution, but to make it even clearer, the Bill of Rights was added. So that those, and I should say in the original Constitution, the federal judiciary was created in particular to be a buffer against majoritarian pressures, because federal judges, as we now are in the process of witnessing, maybe the non-process of choosing a Supreme Court justice, that of course majoritarian politics play a very significant role, but once the federal judge is confirmed, he or she essentially has lifetime tenure, specifically to give them the security to dare to buck popular tides. And thank goodness we've had the Supreme Court and other federal courts that have withstood, for example, in the South during after Brown versus Board of Education, the enormous majoritarian pressures to resist the Supreme Court decision and not engage in school segregation.
Thank you for coming out here. We really enjoyed the lecture.
Well, thank you for being here.
I have a couple of questions here. First one is I would like to know your thoughts about the Supreme Court equating money and speech. Mm-hmm. And secondly, in light of President Obama's strong understanding of the expression and the free expression and the recent shooting in South Carolina, and then our reaction to asking to take down the flag, the Confederate flags and all that, which, I mean, we all enjoyed the reaction because that went totally backfired on the perpetrator who wanted us to, incite hate than rather the other way. But at some level, we did try to take down a certain expression of hate that most of us feel is,
These are fantastic questions. I feel I have to compress my entire free speech semester-long course into a few minutes to answer these really probing, excellent questions. So on the first question, you stated it the way 99% of people do, that the Supreme Court has said money is speech. No! Everybody knows that money is not speech, and the Supreme Court has never said that. What it has said, and what 100% of the justices have agreed with, is the following, that if you want to propagate your message, to distribute it and to disseminate it, it takes money to do that. Now, admittedly, this is less true in the internet age than it was way back in the 1970s when the Supreme Court first issued that holding. But even now, in the context of running a political campaign, the broadcast over-the-air media have been especially important, indeed, most people would say essential, for getting your message out, and that is extremely expensive. So therefore, the Supreme Court simply made the factual observation that if we limit the amount of money you can spend to disseminate your message isn't going to be delivered as widely and effectively as if we didn't limit that. And even though there's disagreement on other aspects of the Supreme Court's campaign finance jurisprudence, 100% of them agree with that proposition. So let me just tell you that what they do disagree with is whether there is sufficient justification nonetheless to restrict people's ability to engage in financing activities to get their message out there. And that's a whole other question which I'd be happy to talk to you about. But my bottom line on that is that although we definitely need reforms to the current system, the vaunted reforms that we have now that involve limiting finance have done more harm than good, specifically to the goal of opening up opportunities to challenge incumbents. The current laws have been functioning as incumbent protection acts, and we shouldn't be surprised because that's the motivation of the people who are passing them. I think if we're going to have real reform, it's going to have to come from some other source. So probably enough said on that. I could talk for another hour, but great question. And then the second question, also really interesting question, because I defend and the ACLU defends the right of individuals to display the Confederate flag, not surprisingly, right? In fact, we made that argument in a Supreme Court case that was decided this summer about when state governments open license plates for a fee to put an individually chosen message. We argued that you should be free to choose to put the Confederate flag on your license plate because that is your personal expression. So just the way you could go to a public park, it's government property, but the government opens it for the use of whatever private messages people want to put up there. That's what we argued should be done with the license plate. However, the Supreme Court has said that if you, and I agree, that if you are talking about government speech, the government may choose what messages it wants to issue and what messages it does not want to issue. The government itself doesn't have a responsibility to be viewpoint neutral in what it chooses to say, right? So if it's running an anti-drug campaign, it doesn't have to balance it out by running a pro-drug campaign. And I think it's completely appropriate for the government of South Carolina to say, we as a government are not going to continue to air that message. So thank you. Thank you for those two excellent questions.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk today. So I have two questions, one of which
Everybody here has two questions.
I know, because this is a deeper issue that gets into morality.
I'm glad you're not going to three. That would tax my memory.
No, and I'll be short, I promise. So the first question is that you talk about in your definition, in the definition of, hate speech and things like that. The question about whether it constitutes a threat and the imminence of that threat. And so, of course, it's difficult because at what point does a repeated use of a slur or hate speech become actually threatening, and when do you pin that down? So that's the first part. But then I also have a question about the subjectivity with which laws are applied. So you have, I in theory support free speech, but it's not necessarily applied equally, and so I think that particularly now, there's a certain connotation associated with free speech that affords members of certain groups the opportunity to speak their mind, but other groups are met with police blockades and things like that when they're also exercising their free speech rights. And a lot of times that subjectivity is based on stereotypes and things like that. So harm, and then the subjectivity of the application of the free speech allowance.
Okay, again, see, I'm giving you A+ for your great questions. I think you were I talked about several categories of harm, and each one is distinct. And I understand in everyday speech we tend to lump them together and blur them together. So a threat causes the harm of putting a reasonable person who is the target of the threat in fear that he or she is going to be subject to some kind of violent or other criminal activity. And the speaker who conveys the threat has to intend the target to be in fear. The speaker does not have to intend to actually carry out the harm, because the law recognizes if you are reasonably afraid that you are going to be subject to an attack, that's already causing harm to you. It's inhibiting your freedom of movement, right? You might not go to certain places, you might not go out at night, you might not go out alone. So, but it has to be a reasonable fear, and it has to be targeted. It can't just be a general statement. So for one really important free speech case the Supreme Court decided way, way long ago was a group of Ku Klux Klan people were having a rally out in the middle of field, just they themselves. And they said, we should send the blacks back to Africa, and we should send the Jews back to Israel, and they were brandishing arms. Well, that wasn't a threat because it wasn't targeted at anybody in particular. It didn't create a reasonable fear on the part of anybody. When you talked about the idea of repetition, that to me sounds like it's most likely to come under the free speech exclusion for harassing speech. Again, like a threat, it has, and the Supreme Court uses the term true threat to talk about, we use the term loosely in everyday speech, but to be non-protected under the First Amendment, a true threat. What that has in common with harassment is that it is targeted at an individual or small group of individuals, right? So it's not just a general idea. Oh, I think the civil libertarians are terrible and should be shot. I wouldn't like that idea, but it would not threaten me or harass me. So harassment is targeted at an individual or small groups, persistent and pervasive, so repetition is important. And, I would say basically any in-your-face insult that's, not just an off-the-cuff, but repeated certainly would make it pervasive. That really interferes with your opportunity to function equally. And what else? Then the other examples are hate crimes. And let me give you an example there. Hate speech is often used as an element of a hate crime. We recently had an example just 1 week ago in my home state of Connecticut, where in response to the Paris shootings, a young man went and shot a rifle at a mosque in Connecticut, and on his Facebook page, it was general statements in that situation. He said something like, "All Muslims should die," and so that was treated as a hate crime and successfully prosecuted as such. And then the last example would be intentionally inciting somebody to imminent violence that is actually likely to occur. That covers a big swath of actual examples, but it certainly does not include any general statement that we strongly disagree with, that makes us angry. Okay, and your second question was about not enforcing the law equally. That's my real problem. That is why we have to so strongly defend a robust freedom of speech, including freedom that extends to speech that is deeply unpopular with the majority of whatever community it is. So in Ferguson, Missouri, for example, my ACLU colleagues were constantly, and that's where it started most recently, but spread around the country, constantly coming to the defense of people who are trying to exercise the First Amendment rights, not only freedom of speech, but freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government, because they were being systematically suppressed on the basis of the unpopularity of their ideas. It's no coincidence that it's Black History Month, what a wonderful opportunity to get to make this point, that Martin Luther King wrote his great letter from the Birmingham jail. He was imprisoned for having tried to exercise his free speech rights, and hate speech laws and their counterparts were the tools that were used throughout the South to suppress civil rights demonstrators, because to those people, this was hate speech. It was challenging their most cherished ideas, their sacred way of life. It was seen as, bringing about a revolution and chaos, and my goodness, mixed marriages and all these, what they saw saw as evil. And it's really interesting to see how the civil rights movement absolutely depended on a robust freedom of speech. And you gave a really good example of one of the points I made, that if we want to protect, if we want to advance equality, we especially need a free speech rules that are strongly and equally enforced, including especially on behalf of ideas and speakers who are less popular and less powerful. And we certainly do not want to go in the opposite direction of giving the majoritarian officials or the officials who are responsive to the majorities in the community power to pick and choose which ideas they favor and disfavor.
Hi.
Hi.
So
I'm sorry, where are you?
I'm right here. I'm to your right.
Oh, hi.
So I was wondering if I could maybe appeal to your experience, because I think I found that in a lot of cases, people also can choose to be offended. And so once they tell you what you've said is offensive, they're the victim, and it kind of cuts off any sort of communication. And from the first questions that were asked, I feel that there's almost a sense that we here have kind of the same sense of what free speech should be, and that we should defend hate speech. But it's almost assuming that we can have a conversation. And I think, so I'm French, and it's been really hard to swallow the last year. And I think it's very hard to understand how we can have any sort of discussion with the people from ISIS or the people who perpetrated the crimes when there is no direct threat. They're not saying you, particular French person, are going to die, but they are threatening literally just at random. And so where's the limit, and how do you deal with people with whom you can't speak when you're trying to defend your rights?
Yeah, well, that's, boy, in the United States, we used to have a phrase in American law that we're not going to allow a heckler's veto. In other words, if somebody doesn't like your speech, they can silently protest, but they can't disrupt you so that you, the speaker, and your willing listeners can't hear the message. That's a heckler's veto. Sadly, in light of the developments you're talking about, we're now referring to the assassin's veto, right? I don't understand how the editors at Charlie Hebdo had the courage to continue their exercise of free speech, knowing that they were on hit lists. Salman Rushdie, the same thing. He came out of hiding even though there's still a fatwa against him. I tell you, I was subject to a couple of death threats that if I went and gave a speech that I was scheduled to give, not this one, I assure you, that my audience would be a target, and I immediately wanted to cancel the speech. I mean, so that's very powerful if you fear that the cost is not just that you're going to be suppressed, or that you're going to be suppressed permanently, right? You're going to be killed. So the answer that the government has to have is to provide us physical safety against that actual violence. And by the way, that's another reason why I really don't like the terminology that we hear on so many campuses about a safe space or keeping students safe from disturbing ideas when we have students being shot on campuses. I mean, that's the kind of safety that we have to provide them, is physical safety. And it's one of the reasons why, I'm not one of these civil libertarian, I don't know anybody who supports Patrick Henry's legendary statement, give me liberty or give me death. I don't think I can exercise my liberty unless I'm alive. And it's one of the reasons why I'm very supportive of police and military, because I have been in situations where there isn't law and order, where there is anarchy, and that to me is at least as suppressive of liberty as a martial law, too much in the other extreme. So we need to do whatever is necessary to provide physical safety against that kind of threat. But in the meantime, if people are going to self-censor because they don't want to face those threats, I understand. In preparing for this talk, I did some research and I saw that we do have a couple of cartoonists who did draw images of the Prophet Muhammad, intending it to be satirical and to raise discussion. It doesn't matter what their motivation is from the perspective of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They were immediately put on death lists and they've gone into hiding and basically are going to be in hiding for the rest of their lives. Well, until or unless we extirpate ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Hi.
Is this sharp speech trumped by blunt speech?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Is this sharp speech that's going on here trumped by blunt speech?
Sharp speech trumped by blunt speech? I'm so sorry, I don't understand the question. Sorry.
What's the difference between terrorism and hate crimes or hate speech?
Okay, so hate speech is, again, it's not a legal term of art, okay? So the Supreme Court has not said this, the way it's carved out a category called harassment or incitement, which I've defined. But we tend to use it in everyday speech, everyday conversation, as speech that conveys discriminatory attitudes on the basis of social identity characteristics. So it's speech that conveys a particular idea, a discriminatory idea. Hate crime, I think is the term that we mostly use, but I think it's more accurately understood as a discriminatory crime. And the Supreme Court has actually held, even though it's held that you may not punish speech just because it conveys a hateful idea, you may impose an enhanced penalty, a higher penalty on a crime as to which the victim is singled out for a discriminatory reason. You select the victim for assault because it is a black person or a Muslim person or a female, or et cetera. And to prove that there is a discriminatory motive in selecting the victim, the court has said that the prosecutor may rely on evidence that the defendant engaged in hate speech. But there has to be a really tight and direct causal connection. It can't be that 5 years ago the person made a racist remark and then attacks a black person. That's not going to be enough to satisfy the connection requirement. So, in terrorism, again, there are many statutory definitions, and they vary all over the map. It's interesting, when we had a Red Scare in this country at the beginning of early in the 20th century, and then we had the Cold War in the middle of the 20th century, if you read the statutes that were passed at the time against socialism and syndicalism and anarchism and communism, the word terrorist is used in all of those statutes. So interestingly enough, it tends to be used for methods that will bring about the end of the government itself, something that poses an existential threat to the state. That's the way it tends to be used in those statutes. I think colloquially, we use it with random violence against civilians in order to strike terror in their hearts and to spread panic and terror throughout society, throughout a community, in order to have a destabilizing impact. And the idea very much is to change government policy in that way, to bring down capitalism, to bring down democracy, to bring down secularism. So it's using civilians to achieve, to damage the government.
Thank you. We think we have time for maybe one more question, and I saw your hand.
So to what extent do you believe that it's the government's responsibility to protect minors, particularly young children, from objectionable or obscene content? And to what extent do you believe it's the parents' responsibility to make sure that their children aren't consuming objectionable material?
Oh, I think you can guess my answer to that. I used to say the ACLU is a pro-family organization. We just don't believe that Big Brother should be a member of the traditional American family. And interestingly enough, there are constitutional decisions that uphold the right of parents to make fundamental decisions about the education and upbringing of their own children. So you can invoke both First Amendment values and rights of parents and families for self-determination values. Thank you all very much. Fantastic discussion.